Okay, you're good to go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of Future Perfect, Catastrophe and the Contemporary, our colloquium, which is part of the Warehouse 421 Curatorial Development Exhibition Program in partnership with BCAR. Tonight's conversation will be with Raqs Collective, and our discussant for this evening is Falguni Guliani, who is a curator and a researcher based in Delhi. I will let Falguni take lead on the conversation from here. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Faisal. I'll just really quickly introduce Raqs Media Collective, not that they need an introduction, but Shama kindly sent me over a little bio note, and I'll just read from there. Raqs Media Collective was formed in 1992 in Delhi, India by Monica Narula, Jibesh Bagchi, and Shuddhabrata Sengupta. The word Raqs in several languages denotes an intensification of awareness and presence that's attained by whirling, turning, and being in a state of revolution. Raqs Media Collectives takes this sense to mean kinetic contemplation and a restless entanglement with the world and with time, all themes that we're sure they'll unpack for us today. Raqs enlists objects such as early modern tiger automata from southern India, or a biscuit from the Paris Commune, or a cup salvaged from an ancient Mediterranean shipwreck, to turn them into devices to sniff and taste time. Devices unfold thus in order to undertake historical subterfuge and philosophical query. Raqs practices across several media, making installation, sculpture, video, performance, text, lexica, and most importantly, curation. In 2000, they co-founded the Sarai program at CSDS New Delhi and ran it for a decade, where they innovated on infrastructural conditions of practices and knowledge production, and also edited the 9-volume Sarai Reader series. The members of Raqs Media Collective live and work in Delhi, India, and they're presently working on toxicity, care, and the luminosity of friendship. I'll let Monica take it from here.
Okay, before Monica can take it, I will just unmute it. I'm unmuted. Okay.
No, I was muted. Sorry.
Okay, so I'm saying before Monica takes over, I will just say thank you, Falguni, for that introduction, and thanks to Shama and Rohit for inviting us. Thanks to Faisal at Warehouse for staging this occasion, and thanks to all of you. Some we seem to know, some we new, and what we plan to do is to try to a 30-35 minutes kind of excavation of some of the questions that Rohit has been posing and from BCAR to us through this last few months. And we looked at many of our own notes, and we tried to rethink some of the propositions and try to tell a kind of combine and try to tell a story of the contemporary that can give us a little bit of edge towards how to make at what Rohit say, a cut at the present, but also try to actually figure out how to inhabit in a more interesting way with the larger collectives in the world. So Monica, would you share the screen before? The relationship between knowledge and laboring over the last few hundred years can be written as a history of a certain kind of loss of control. The core operations that fuel capital increasingly transfers cognitive and design control away from those who work and towards the machinic intelligence they work with and the rules and protocols of the apparatus they work within. In a word, proletarianization, a phenomenon manifested in the 19th century, becomes generalized from the specific experience of industrial proletariat to an experience shared by all in most domains of work and in the generalized condition of labor. This tends to show that human beings are not in the know of what is actually going on from any one location of action or contemplation. We now stand in the midst of a massive escalation of the degree of the unknown and the unknowable, now encoded in the very scaffolding of production itself. This magnification of the unknown is also an amplification of risk. That's one way in which we think about all the beware and warning signs that demand our attention. Beware, we are told constantly, of the possibility of the moment's overheating and turning the passage of time into something beyond anybody's control. Now that's an interesting thought, as it is happening even now at this very moment. How do we know what the temperature of time at any given time is? At what point does it cross over a critical edge?
Sometime in the early June of 2018, in what seemed like a different world set in a different time, an elevator descended into darkness and then opened into the reactor core of a nuclear power plant that sits by the sea, within 25 miles of 3 active geological fault lines and 5 miles from the caldera of a dormant volcano in the Bataan Peninsula at one edge of the Philippine archipelago. Bataan, the site of the reactor, is also remembered as the topography of a death march during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines in the Second World War. There was more than one kind of fault line crisscrossing under the feet that walked the plant. This journey can be read into the idea of a trip, into many signs of caution and warning. That's the kind of zigzag move we all are now in the habit of making. Each time we make it, some minor epiphanies hopefully make themselves available to all of us. Construction on this Bataan power plant, an expensive public relations exercise undertaken, as these things tend to be, by a ruler keen to earn his place in history by promising unlimited energy, began in 1976 and was almost completed in 1985. It was meant to be one of 6 such nuclear plants. The dream of unlimited nuclear energy is in some senses a fantasy of the domination of matter by the control of time. It is to undertake what the sun does and what it has taken several billion years to do by a set of control reactions set in motion by flipping switches that smash atoms. The dictator in question, Ferdinand Marcos, was overthrown by a popular movement in the wake of rigged elections and fled his country on the 26th of February of 1986. Then exactly 2 months later, on Saturday, 26th of April, an accident occurred in faraway Ukraine in the then Soviet Union during a safety test on a steam turbine of reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl power plant. A planned power decrease during an electrical test resulted in power in the reactor dropping almost to 0. And then after the test was completed, a routine reactor shut down, leading to an uncontrollable nuclear chain reaction. The Chernobyl disaster took place because of the strange and uncanny intersection between the planned and the unpredictable. A routine reactor shut down, and that led to an unprecedented chain reaction. Far away in the Philippines, the combination of a regime change and a distant accident ensured that the recently completed Bataan nuclear power plant was never commissioned. In Chernobyl, planned procedures produced unplanned consequences, which no one was prepared for. In Bataan, a facility was prepared to meet an eventuality that never happened because there was a change of plan.
From the elevator into the control room. At the heart of the command and control center of the plant, next to operation and safety manuals, was a telephone without a number, or dials, or a keypad. It was designed to be used only if things went catastrophically wrong. If that happened, picking up the receiver would trigger a ring in the presidential palace, disturbing the big man's speech, the big man's sleep, if need be. It never rang. The massive increase in productivity brings with it a heightened sense of danger. Nothing embodies this as acutely as the scenario of the control room that is at the heart of the production process. Even in the control room, no one is really in the know of control. This is a work of fiction. Here, fact is digestible only because it is laced with fictions. For everything to continue to function, the story of the control room must continue to be told, and it must be believed not just by those who listen, but even by those who know that they themselves are making up the story. When does the alarm or the telephone ring? Do we get missed calls from time to time? Is the ominous future that doesn't take place but is always threatening to do so an instance of catastrophic anesthesia?
Radioactive winds from Chernobyl flowed into northern Sweden, as far north as Luleå. And the Chernobyl accident was one trigger in a series of It was one trigger in a series of triggers that also led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it, the decision by the Swedish military to downgrade the threat of nuclear war. That is how the Statsberget cave came to be decommissioned. The army left the mountain. An engineer bought it and thought of making a luxury hotel. With a detour via Gaddafi, an interesting story, but not for now. And he landed up doing mushroom farming. In the interim, young people tag and graffiti inside the cave system. The telephones were left behind, waiting. On being offered it as a possible site, we found ourselves underground, inside a mountain cave in Luleå in the Norrbotten province, close to the Arctic Circle. This cave had once, in the heyday of the Cold War, been prepared to serve as the command headquarters of the Swedish military in the event of a nuclear attack. Thankfully, it has never had to serve that function and was eventually decommissioned. The Bataan reactor never got commissioned or operational, so it was never decommissioned. It has always remained suspended, always being forever primed. But in this massive and labyrinthine cavern system in northern Sweden, We offer detour through unfolding scenarios that featured 1 ton of iron pellets, a meteorite with specs that are 500 million years older than the Earth, found footage, and a filmic meditation on blood, iron, shifting mining towns, and lost reindeer. Now abandoned, this cave system was haunted by what it was never used for. At the nerve center of this labyrinth was another unnumbered telephone, waiting to ring in the event of a nuclear attack. And as we said, and as we know, and as things turned out, this has never happened. We did enlarge the death report and positioned it differently in the same room that we had found it, to remind us of this future that never happened. 2 telephones at 2 facilities at 2 distant edges of the world, both decommissioned from the fate of a nuclear chain reaction becoming operational, and of dealing with another nuclear chain reaction going differently operational or critical. The phones have not rung, not really, not outside our work, that is. These
scenarios of untested fortification reminds us of another fortress we had been in, the Frenzen-Feste in Sutreol, once a southern edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now the northern frontier of Italy. This fortress had been built to defend against an attack by northern armies, which never occurred. The fortress never got attacked. The world wore past, bypassed it. It was not significant enough site for it. It was kept as a government facility and not made open to the general public until 2008 as one of Manifesta's locations. It was rumored that gold from bank vaults were hidden by Nazis here, and the code to his escape lost. We too did not find much gold, though we tried through our curatorial maneuvers. This fortress, the fortress, is a clue to the seductive defensive default of commanding power. Mladen Dola, invited to respond to Forteza by us, wrote, "The fortress conceals a hidden interior, a dangerous secret at its heart. It is the formidable barrier to the gaze which can only dwell on its impressive front. The fortress prohibits and is prohibited. It is the invisible threat inside the prominently visible."
Backstage behind another control room at a large Hadron Collider near Geneva, not far from a facility called the Antimatter Factory, is a bank of servers storing data. In just 1 year, 2018, when we were there, 115 million gigabytes of information were stored on magnetic tape. There's so much information that no one really knows what's in there. But whether this altered, super translated information may be readable or knowable in any meaningful way is a question that is almost impossible to answer. And no, the wager is not simply on ignorance as the threshold and foundation of all acts of knowledge. Rather, it is the conjecture and paradox that insists that to know anything at all, one has to know, at least know of that which is categorically unknowable. It's like realizing that there is a zero, a nothing, and a something, a one, that is hidden in every number. A nothing that adds, multiplies, divides, and a singularity that accumulates and mates with itself to make any quantity at all possible.
Another room, another stage set, in fact, another bank of telephones. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange, or its ghost, where punters went to stare at telephones and television monitors with fluctuating values of stocks and to drink tea. The veteran punters could have done everything that needed doing on their computers or their phones. But some of them still like going to what looked like the control room of finance. And the reason why it was still running was not because anything really happened there. It didn't. But because television finance reporters could stand in front of it and do their pieces to camera. Especially at a time of volatility, the bank of monitors and telephones and men looking busy made it look like someone or something was in charge.
The stock exchange as a location, as a site of actual transaction, is actually redundant, and the performance of control vital to the maintenance of the impression of financial competence and normality is not as effective without the setting of the stock exchange. One way of thinking about this operation is as an elaborate kind of play, somewhere between a masquerade and a gamble, where the role play code switching between unwritten rules of the game as the throw of a weighed dice on the board decide the moves. Does this mean we have to take every performance of competence with more than a pinch of salt? Salt does not have a way of arresting the appearance. Salt does have a way of arresting the appearance of decay.
If you take a teardrop, you get some water and a lot of salt. Deep underground salt mines are places where nuclear waste is stored. And so a salt mine vanishes and appears as a warning sign. Symbols, such as this one for danger, are compressions of thought and apprehension of caution. The symbol for biohazard is a set of 3 intersecting crescents arrayed on top of a circle, a sign that, according to its designer, Charles Baldwin, is unique, memorable, but meaningless. The sign may have been meaningless in 1996 when it was designed and tested, but over nearly 3 decades of use has now come to acquire the currency of danger. But every willful misstep, every greedy grab is an intimate intimidation to our own longer future. So how do we stay together in care of each other when the fold of our collectivity is augured under the mark of contamination? But there's this thing with salt. It corrodes and at the same time inhibits decay. It's the stuff of which our tears are made. It's what seasons our food and what makes it impossible to quench your thirst at sea. It gives life and takes it. It seasons and poisons, sometimes at the same time.
You can get lost walking on salt. At the Great Salt Desert of the Rann of Kutch, that shape-shifting territory between land and sea on the edge of another peninsula in Western India, salt makes the earth, sky, and ocean meet on a whiteout frontier. There are people who mine salt and have been doing it for thousands of years. The Agaria are a nomadic tribe of the Rann of Kutch, now classed as denotified, as in they are no longer notified as a criminal tribe, but still required to be under the constant surveillance of local police stations. Agaria's tradition-sanctioned occupation, which most of them are still bound by, is salt farming. There are somewhere around 10,000 Agaria families concentrated in the Dhangadara, Karagora, Halwat, Kantapur, Adesar, and Malia salt zones of the Gurkhor Sanctuary, the recently demarcated reserve for the endangered Indian wild ass, the Equus Himalayas Khur. Agarias pump brine from the soil to dig a new salt bore. The pump runs on diesel, as Agaria salt, and a single Agaria salt farmer can easily consume 9 barrels of diesel in a season to make the salt that can be taken to market. The escalation of the price of diesel escalates the cost of farming salt. A book from the 1990s, Kali Majuri Dholo Mitu, Black Labor, White Salt by Dilip Rampaya, describes the legs of Agarias as hardened by exposure to salt, of a lifetime spent working with salt. When an Agaria dies, their legs have too much salt in them. Salt is inert, non-flammable. It is used as a natural fire extinguisher. Agaria legs do not catch fire when cremated. They are removed from the bodies and buried in the salt flats, along with their salt-making tools. The oldest dinosaur fossil found in the 21st century is a possibly 135 million-year-old Jurassic-era dinosaur hip and 2 leg bones found in the Lodi village in the realm of Kutch. Salt fossilizes organic remains through a process known as perimineralization. The memory of the forest that existed before land became sea and sea became land is kept alive by salt crystals. The fossils of Agaria limbs, too, will be faithfully preserved for posterity. Landscapes remember the labor lost in them. Nothing preserves as well as the toxic, but nothing corrodes as well either.
The care of life and the care of self are not possible without care with toxicity. The splitting of care and the toxic is detrimental to thinking about the future of life on this planet. To live with toxicity is a condition of life. We have to think about our sickness and our offal and our residues of constant production and consumption. More and more, pharmacology is a balance of toxicity within the human body. The life of millions is extended by this balancing of pharmacological toxicity in their bodies. As our life expectancy increases, so will various chronic conditions. Health will no longer be conceived without toxicity. The care of life, the care of those we love, the care of neighborhoods, the care of others. On the other hand, the sustained circulation of abhorrent images to terrify us is a continuation of the civilizational blind spot that can only think of maintaining the life of some by the banishment of others. We have to begin to think of life with toxicity and without banishment. We can do this with the self-knowledge of a civilization that this banishment is a cruelty and a folly.
So, I'm going to read from Bharat Chandra Rai's In Praise of Annada Mongol Kabba. Pret Bhutgan, Dhai Ongan, Andhar Koilo Dhulai, Jhup Jhup Jhap, Dup Dup Dap, Lomfo Jomfo Dia Chale, Mohadhum Dham, Hake Hum Ham, Joy Mohadev Bole. In some of the stories told by some of our grandmothers, we are given the image of Shiva's wedding party, which is a description that you just heard. A riot of the ghostly and the ghastly having one hell of a time. It's possible to think of our time and of our place in it as if we were processionists in Shiva's entourage. If we did that, we would be not in the control room, but in the out of control street, facing not the hotline, but a range of personae, roles, places, positions, practices, persons, ports, and monuments. We would encounter permanent inhabitants, transients, travelers, hackers, beings who came alive at dawn, midnight, at siesta time, or at twilight. They would traverse fluid constellations across actual spaces, desired inhabitations, and imagined cities. Together, they concert an activation analogous not to banishment, but to an entourage effect, which is a debated concept in therapeutic pharmacology around cannabis, which argues that the components of the chemical combination that makes cannabis what it is act much better in a relational field of interaction and in combination with others than in isolation. In nature, nothing acts in a pure state.
Earth, sun, moon, and the heavens have broken their ranks. It is a disordered procession. In that hour where even birds haven't had alarm clocks stir their feathers, they, with the tired legs of an unspent, unswept mind, are straddling the border between night and dawn. Summer is here. There is urgent and close filled with sounds of sirens. The streets empty, giving way to a season of frustration with thwarted promises. Perhaps a month ago, or was it a year? Or was it in the turn of an afternoon? The room is lost. Inside grow gusts of memory with no time left in them. The earth spun just a little faster this year. They have heard this said on the radio. The universe is accelerating. You would want the carousel to stop when the stomach lurches this way and that, slower than feet, faster than well, about as badly timed as the dance steps of lovelorn destiny. Time sieves away, a haze. Calendars too rebel, dates all over the place, headlines walking away from events, timetables stacked one on top of the other in warehouses with distress sales. A man on the TV says that his hourglass is half full. Actually, it is just as it always was, as it always is, an ever-present limit riddle from which to return, either to potential or to breakdown.
और बंटन के चले बम भोला लीले भांग धतूर का गोला बोले जे हरदम चले लड़का परा के बाबूती लगा के बाल की सजा के ना ओ शिव जी बिहान चले बाल की सजा के बाबूती लगा के बाल की सजा के ना
Okay, that's it. So we can take a break now.
Yeah, Goody, that was great. Thank you so much. We should take a 5-minute break to reflect on a law and maybe come back. And Goody, you can start with engaging Raqs on that presentation, that wonderful presentation, and then we'll open it up. Thank you guys so much.
Shama, are we good to start?
Yeah, I think so.
I think everyone's here. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll sort of just begin by, first of all, thanking Raqs and Monica, Jibesh, and Shuddha for taking us through your presentation in this really characteristic Raqs manner that it unfolds in scenes and episodes. And what sort of emerges for me through this presentation is really the self-reflexive nature of your practice and how it resists so much a kind of categorization. And, you know, it goes back to what I said in my bio, that the kind of entanglements that you produce are, you know, they're kind of productive entanglements. And I thought a way for me to do this would be, I'll start off with a comment, and I have 2-3 questions, but maybe I'll ask just one question and then we'll open it up, ask my colleagues here to chime in, and maybe then I can come back with questions a little later at the end. So if that sounds good, I just want to, maybe I'll start by saying, you know, Monica, I'm sorry, I'm just getting a notification here that says my connection is unstable. So if I
we can hear
break
you
off in the middle, can someone alert me? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jibesh. Yeah, so I was saying, you know, when you were taking us through the story of the Chernobyl plant and that wonderful exhibition site that you had, and of course we saw the video Blood of Stars that was shared with our cohort today, you know, and what emerged for me is how your practice uses material as a marker of time, right? So if it's iron, it's present in our blood, it's present, you know, deep in the interiors of Earth, it's present in the stars, and how you're sort of, you know, treading questions of scale. So at one time, you know, your curiosity is sort of engaged in the outer space, and at the same time, it's also engaged in the deep interiorities of the body, right? So just these ideas of using material as a marker of time and having these kind of, you know, treading these macrocosmic and microcosmic scales is something I think, if you can, I'd like to touch on in today's discussion. But I really want to start my question with this. I mean, you can correct me if I'm misquoting you somewhere, but you know, I read this thing in one of your, I think it was for the Barcelona Biennale, where you said it's not about changing the world, it's about changing the time. And I want to focus my question, or the first of my questions, on time, right? And how we understand the nature of time in relation to what we're discussing today, which is this kind of catastrophic amnesia, which I hope to come to later. Right, so I'm just sort of, I want to go back a little bit to your Barcelona Biennale sort of text, and talk about, you know, because when you say we're talking about a catastrophic amnesia, you say it's an ominous future that doesn't exist but is always threatening to do so. And so many other times in your practice, you've referred to time as being something that we're constantly swimming through, and it's like we occupy the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. We're not on a linear axis. And what I find your practice is doing is that it's breaking down ideas of a linear homogeneous time that we inherit from, say, Western metaphysics, and it's interpreting them in really playful gestures. Like I said, you know, even this presentation unfolded, even the Yokohama Triennale unfolded in these scenic episodes. So if you could talk a little bit, just to start us off, on how you understand, you know, this sort of playful gesture of time and how it comes together as you know, something that's not linear in your work, in your thinking.
Sudha, Monica. So thank you for the connecting this question of scale and time. I think one of the things that, you know, many people growing up and like finding their adulthood from the mid-90s onwards, had put into question a series of transition narratives, series of ideas of time where you are locked in some narrative that is independent of you. So this kind of, so time becomes some kind of a question that becomes part of everybody's thinking process. It's there in there is in so many ways, in so many ways. A whole generation have been trying to unpack this presence of this transition narratives on their weight of the transition narrative, on their ideas of history, on the ideas of society, ideas of contemporary, So one of the things that it does is that it made us very alert to this question of time, and also because we come from we kind of think a lot through a medium of duration, which is cinema, and where there is a lot of this meditation on duration and how duration is organized. So that is one reason. These are the two reasons where the question of time becomes very important, and time becomes important in the sense that it's a material also, as much as it is a conceptual category that you have to unpack, unlearn, and so as it working as a material for your thinking, and when you work with material, you discover all kinds of incongruities, angularities, and very different kind of intensities in it hidden. So like in the cave, the time horizon questions to us was that questions of time horizon was posed through the meteorite and the iron pellet. Iron pellet takes us into the ground. Meteorite takes us little into a different temporal scale. So that what was being held in that caves was this by multiplying the time horizons in it, you kind of make it extremely relatively observable. So that anxiety that was the cave, that anxiety that was the telephone kind of exchange, you could understand it as a specific moment in a journey and a specific story locked in many movements of many time horizons. So that's where the scale, the narratives of time, the scale of time, and also materialities around time emerges in our thinking, and it keeps on doing strange things to us. It works on us rather than sometimes working on it. I'm sure my colleagues have a more. Monica, you're mute.
Sorry. I think what's interesting about this question of time, of course, is not just because it's an idea that is a narrative, and the narrative always comes from a location, right? So basically, when we're talking in terms of human scale, it is always historical time in that sense. I mean, I only recently discovered, for example, that 150 million years of dinosaurs, but before that, there were another 100 million years or something of these creatures which were like crocodiles that were actually bipedal. But there's no archaeological facticity to that, so we can only, or very little. So very strange sort of story to tell when I'm talking about the idea that when we're talking about time, we're only talking about time in relation to, right? In relation to the people telling that story about time. And in that sense, I think this is partly why we bring out the material that you began by talking about, like why we use the idea of the material, such as the cup that you said in the bio. So a cup that is lost in sea 2,000 years ago, when it re-emerges, when it is no longer submerged, it is not so much a question of what it tells about then, it's also a question about what it tells about now. And like in MACPA, one of the stories or the sources that we used was of a robot that in a mall recently voluntarily appended itself into a fountain in the mall without being commanded to do so. So the question of time becomes an interesting one when we start parlaying the idea of who is it being addressed in relation to. One is, of course, the material history of, say, the cup that is 2,000 years old, which has the word Pamphilos written on it. But Pamphilos, we know, also means the friend of all. So what does that cup, what kind of aura does it have if you were to look at it as an artifact, or what kind of network of potential and energies does it open out when it becomes something outside of its one moment in time, but into another moment of time? And to me, this relationship with machinic intelligence, because it has no specific time frame, because it has no, I mean, there's a sort of idea of futurity that is assumed, but actually the future, as we've written somewhere else, is the present, right? I mean, how long is it now? So these questions become opened out in different ways if one parses them through the idea of time. You know, it's not that they are not questions that we don't think about in other terms. Obviously, we do. It's just, I think that when of various frames that one could use, what happens when time is used, it opens out possibly other kinds of terms, or at least, or as you said, playful terms are possible.
If I might, I think you have you've given us a cue, Falguni, to think about these questions yourself by pointing to materials. I mean, I guess philosophically we are materialists, and that makes a hell of a lot of a difference in terms of how you approach realities. The thing about materials is that materials, when materials and time meet, they change. Materials change. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Everything moves towards entropy, and that is a function of the intersection of materials and time. It's also the difference in that sense between physics and metaphysics. In metaphysics, nothing need change. There could be ideal realities that are immutable. You know, like I was very struck recently that our Prime Minister of the Republic of India inaugurated a metal sculpture, a very large metal sculpture of an idealist philosopher who said, you know, what is it? Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. The Brahma is the truth, and the world, Jagat, the materiality, is a lie. So it's very interesting to think of a sculpture of a person who says materials are lies, right? Because it's like a paradox. If the sculpture, if the metal is a lie, then the sculpture cannot hold the truth of the metaphysical claim that nothing changes. So here again, I mean, in all of these operations that we presented before you, I think we were telling a story of a control room and an out of control situation. And the control room is the story of things not changing, or things being insured against the apocalypse that is always imminent, that is always held out as an immutable consequence. So there's a way in which a presentation of the future is made which blackmails the present and the past, and you're mortgaged to it, I guess, by the ideology, by the story of the control room, and by pointing to something else, by pointing out the uncontrollable procession. I think we are reasserting the ghostly and the ghastly and the riotous presence of material force in the universe, so as to say it's Jagat Satyam, the world is truth rather than a lie.
Because you speak of the presentation of future, I know Rohit has a question, but I'll sort of just ask a quick follow-up one, and then I'll let him go next. You know, I sort of want to go back to the phrase that you used, which is catastrophic amnesia, and how it ties into the sort of discussions that we've been having these past couple of weeks of how we understand, you know, contemporary sort of the time that we live in. And you know, because you say the ominous future is something that doesn't exist, but it's threatening to do so. And I'm thinking of that wonderful quote by, I think it's by Agamben, and you've also used it, you know, somewhere, when you say that it's, you know, to read the future, it's like it's to perceive in the darkness of the present, and it's like you're trying to catch a light that's trying to reach us, but it cannot reach us, right? The light of the future. And maybe towards the end of this Q&A, I'll get to talk to you a little bit about your new interest in luminosity and light and how that relates to an understanding of time. But, you know, I'm just thinking about this sort of paradox of not being able to comprehend what the future is already over. right? And how that might help us in the discussions that we've been having of understanding contemporary society. And where I'm coming from, and this is what my question really is, I say this very often, I trained as an economist. So I'm also thinking, especially when you brought up the image of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, I was reminded so much of, there's this, it's called the regulator's paradox, which is that financial capital will always find some kind of loophole in whatever system a regulator makes. And the regulator can never catch up to the new instruments of financial perversion, for the lack of a better word, that they invent, right? And it's kind of like that, the same way that the regulator never catches up to the financial sort of sophistication of the instruments. In a similar manner, it's what I'm understanding from your readings and from your presentation is that it's quite impossible for us to capture that light of the future while we stand in the darkness of the present. So I'm just curious, how do you as practitioners then, who think about time, who make work along these themes, how do you then deal with that paradox in your practice? And perhaps another reason that I'm asking this is because I've noticed, again, I'm going back to the sort of the structure of this presentation and the structure of the Yokohama Triennale, right? About how exhibition making itself then operates for you as curators on a sort of different axis of time. It's not limited to the physical space of the Biennale, right? It can unfold in episodes that sort of, it's like those 5 million incidents that the famous project that you did. So could you speak a little bit about how you deal with that paradox in your practice?
I'm sure my colleagues have something to say, but I found something very striking in your response, which is the phrase catastrophic amnesia. Actually, the phrase that we've been responding to is catastrophic anesthesia. But I think it's very fascinating that you speak of catastrophic amnesia. I think it's a wonderful one because presumably the catastrophe is in the future. And the phrase catastrophic amnesia would require us to forget the future that hasn't yet happened. Which is exactly the kind of zigzag temporal move that some of our work solicits from its publics. So it's like all Freudian slips, it contains a great truth, because anesthesia, which is the opposite of aesthetics, is perhaps an insensate situation, a situation of losing one's senses to the catastrophe, which is quite different from amnesia, which is always the replacement of memory with something else. So before we go on to any other discussion, I just wanted to thank you for this little spark.
No, thank you for pointing it out, because in our past sessions also we've been speaking about memory and how that relates to our understanding of the present moment. So I suppose, like all Freudian slips, they come from somewhere deep within our obsessions.
If you can forget the future, you can surely remember it.
Yeah.
But this darkness, no, the thing with darkness, we love darkness. We like the idea of the darkness. The dark, like darkness is not doesn't produce there is whole thing of denigration of darkness, no? In the last 200 years, 200, 300 years, there is a denigration, and the historical narrative which we taught in school is the dark Middle Ages, the dark ages, So darkness becomes this kind of space, almost like a catastrophic space, almost like the fearful. So it is the forest, it is that which you will lose your pathways, you will lose sense of, but actually darkness is a very fecund state, some of the artists that we work with, we like over a period of time, have been making this rethinking this possibility of completely rethinking, altering our relationship to the very idea of darkness. And actually once you make that turn, a lot of storytelling, a lot of historical narratives, a lot of way of demarcating time, large civilizations, demarcating, you suddenly start understanding it is actually coming from a kind of a way of thinking that didn't want to actually step into the world of darkness. And darkness produces very complex detectabilities. You detect different. You detect your awareness of the world, different senses, the kind of sensorium that it enlarges upon. And the great thing is that you loses the threshold where your body ends. This classic thing that my body ends here, which we are taught in childhood. Your body ends here. And a lot of the time, there was a beautiful Eric Manning, I think, once talking about autistic kid, that they do not, some kids she was working with, they do not make this separation. The body doesn't end. So in darkness, we have the body's limit is produced. You lose that limit. So body doesn't end, your body extends. So in that sense, darkness is a very, darkness for us is not a threat, and not a kind of epistemology that is going to be that from which the other of the light will emerge. So in that sense, it's a bit different. That's why we move towards more luminosities and this kind of thing, which allows a different take on this light dark staging of historical, of people, everything. If you see the way it has been staged, it's completely messed us up in very large numbers. So that's one, and it's nice that you connected. That's one reason we thought through this question of scenographic the friendships, friendships and luminosities and toxicity. So you move to a more spectral idea of the world. You work with more indistinctions, where the felt image is not bodily definable, and that's what a lot of this inquiries are. These are inquiries with the kind of with aesthetic politics, with concepts that we try to be part of in a collective way in the world today.
Actually, a zigzag move I'm reminded of, and I remember we talked about this some years ago. Like when you grow up, one of the things you do early on is to, you find yourself a person, you're naming, and then you find a way of writing that name. But what is interesting is that the thing you learn after that is your signature, and the signature is a gesture towards illegibility, right? So from the legible writing, the print name that you learn to write, which is how you learn, that this set of letters belongs to me and this calls out my name. What is the next move is this learning to make your own signature. And that learning to make your own signature is you feel you've made it, you've acquired it when it is no longer legible, when your name is no longer readable. And I think this quest for illegibility, where the sense of self is not demarcated, is not illumined in that sense by transparency, where there is, there's the possibility of being and yet not being renderable entirely to everyone, and that the mark is an act towards, it's not darkness, and or at least some kind of chiaroscuro, right? It's a play that has to be permitted of not being in a single zone at any one time. And that perhaps is another zigzag move of light and dark.
Thank you. That was a great example. I'll let Rohit go next with this question.
Yes, and speaking of lightness and darkness, the electricity shifts on and off in Beirut, where I am. Thank you so much for the presentation, and Falguni for your wonderful moderation and those responses. I loved it. It was a great argument, and it was a very serious argument, a materialist argument, a visual argument in response to very close to the thematic that I sort of autocratically abused you with or charged you with. So I really appreciate the generosity of that presentation quite a bit. To intervene, the cut was so visible, it was so globalized, it was so materialized in your presentation, across the three of you as well, as usual, which is what's so wonderful. That you've managed to traverse cuts amongst the three of you and produce them and traverse them in your work. The one thing I wanted to try and push on somewhat critically and selfishly is with regards to the second part of the charge, which is the promise of community. And I think the epilogue really dealt with that quite wonderfully. We have to learn to deal with toxicity now. We have to learn to deal with darkness, etc. But could we think of this a bit differently? Like, what would it mean for us to treat all of these cuts that you so wonderfully presented us, right? These anesthetic cuts, these catastrophic anesthetic cuts, as symptoms of not having to deal with toxicity, a desire to not deal with toxicity, right? That we might be able to establish as a human community. So not a coming to terms with, in a driven way, the necessity of the symptom amidst us, right? The catastrophic anesthetic, a cut, but a cut, right, of pure desire, of truth, right? That is a desire to be in a way that does not, that is non-anesthetic, that's courageous, in a certain sense, if we use that Hegelian formulation of resolution, of courage. So this would flip if we looked at these cuts that you presented us as symptoms rather than historicist truths, right? Then the point would be that something like we're not dealing with known unknowns, right? I think as Shoda, you put it at one point, and it's a brilliant Rumsfeldian, sort of a formulation, right? But we're actually dealing with unknown knowns. That despite our desire to not, so it's not a known unknown, it's an unknown known that characterizes the human animal and its desire. That despite our desire to not be in catastrophe, we always are in it. Compulsively, repetitively, and the cuts are anesthetic, a desire to be out of it that just produces more and more in it of catastrophe. So what would it mean to create a cut of desire that was about getting out of catastrophe, getting out of toxicity, getting out of darkness? That doesn't mean a jump to lightness, but a thinking, a making of the cut as truth of the symptom, not of symptom as truth, which I think, really, you guys are obviously clearly thinking very carefully with certainly like the later Deleuze and Godard and Badiou. I think this might be their mistake. Is that they treat what is a symptom, the excess errant, the wandering sans papier, as truth, the one who's outside of the law, outside of the nation state. But actually, that's a symptom of precisely not being able to be home in a place that doesn't have nation states. So it's a very speculative question for you. And I just wanted to thank you again for a tremendous argument and such generosity in responding to my theme.
Should I want?
Sure. I think at one point you've said that there is nothing pure in the state of nature. So the desire for the redemptive value of whether light or darkness is an impossible demand to make. One can be aware of it. Speaking of light and darkness, in the Yokohama Triennial source book, we gesture to this phenomenon called the Cherenkov effect, which is also something that happens in nuclear reactors when they go bust or boom, which is a uncontrollable chain reaction, and photons escape at almost the speed of light. So, and if you happen to be in the presence of a Cherenkov effect, your eye does not see the light, but the light hits the liquid in the aqueous vitreous humor of the eye, and therefore the material of your tears or of the eyeball slows down the light just a little bit, so that the illumination is then visible in the brain as a phenomenon so you see the light without the eyes seeing the light. And that's Cherenkov radiation. It's a kind of phenomenon where light hits the resistance of the material body, right? So you could treat that metaphorically. You could treat that as light meeting darkness, as unknowing meeting the desire to know, and something sensate, something in the sensorium of the body changes. We wrote a text some time ago, which we called Making Bets While Knowing Nothing. And it was a kind of meditation on knowledge and aesthetics. And our guide, so to speak, was actually not Deleuze Guattari, but Mirabai. And she's kind of from a landscape that's not very different from the salt flats, the desert landscape. And she has this fantastic little, chaupai, which says, I think it's Gyan Chausar Mandi Chauhatte Sarat Pasa Sar Ya Dunya Me Rachi Bazi Jeet Bhave Har Sadhu Sant Mahanta Gyani Chalat Kar Pukar Lal Girdhar Jivan Dinchar, which means, this is our rough translation, knowledge is a game, dice roll, players rise and fall, but the world declares, Jagat again, material world declares, all bets are off because victory is defeat. So good Lord, Mirabai is addressing Krishna, telling him, good Lord, listen, be wise, your knowing days are numbered. So it's positing a limit condition to knowledge, not to plead on behalf of unknowing, but to say that unpredictabilities will always change the nature of the game. And that willingness to be open to the unpredictable, the willingness to be open, like, if you think of Chernobyl as the intersection between the planned and the unpredictable, we work a lot on the plan, but we work very little on being open to the unpredictable. That's a fascinating way to think about, let's say, capitalism, where climate change, a minute change in temperature can actually change everything. The presence of a virus can change everything in the world. And there is no way in which we can calculate for this. And in our work, we're very interested in the limits of the calculable. And that's where it's at that kind of border condition between counting and knowing that you can't calculate, let's say. That I don't know if that addresses your question at all, but I'm rambling, but I think that's what it is.
No, but this Rohit, this interesting thing. How do you, if they are symptomatic, reading history symptomatically, reading occurrences symptomatically, structure symptomatically, and then trying to, I think sometimes symptomatic reading pushes the can ahead. It's like it's start not taking the symptom of asking the question of what, and then pushing the can ahead. So that's why one of the reasons, while looking at the cave of nuclear, preparing for nuclear catastrophe, the cave with a huge transmission center and the nuclear power plant, and which linked through a story of Chernobyl, we go to this 19th century fortress, which is more, the walls are much thicker than the nuclear walls. Nuclear walls are actually about 6 meters, like concrete. This fortress, you will get lost, and the wall is so thick that it is almost becomes immeasurable in terms of. So that's where we do the fortress as a symptom to give us a clue to understand whether the architecture of these plants, and whether the telephone, the kind of small telephone and the gigantic architecture, where does it coming from? So you can say it's an archaeology of symptom. If this is symptom of something, how do you do an archaeology of it? So the attempt was to do that, and that's why Malendoler, when he makes this thing that almost like a dense invisibility and threat inside, but an extreme prominence externally. And so in a sense that what we've been trying is to read this doubly. That's why we kind of argue that even the flower there is a double time of flower. You take a flower and give it as a memoriam to someone to remember for eternity, but the flower will perish in few hours. So we read this structures in this double time. The double time is that it is the time, it is in its time, there is a symptomatic way in which a certain history can tell us what it is. But then there is another thing where there is an archaeology you have to do to unpack the form that it has taken. And form not in the sense of just the architectural form in the very form of the command system that it has thought of, and where that comes. So the fortress not being attacked and the rumor of the gold being there is a very kind of allows us to work with and push the can backward, you can say, not forward. It's pushing, finding in another story a little bit of clue to unpack something else somewhere.
What's the can? Sorry, I didn't understand what you meant by
Kicking the can down the road. No? So
Okay.
it is not your problem.
Yeah.
It is like when Falguni talked about regulator versus the market, I was saying that's actually a triumvirate. Regulator, sovereign, and the market. And demonetization is the classic example where all three are in a complete mess. And they kind of, and I think it will take few decades to even figure out what happened to our
Yeah, that's
life.
right. No.
So
Both of these were great, but,
so
but
even
quickly,
if
you could say, I'm interrupting only because of this point of the fortress. So in your presentation, I saw that as being the symptomatic. I saw the fortress as lying exceptionally to the other moments, and that could be. I mean, that could be wrong. I'm just thinking, maybe. But is the fortress in line with the other cuts that?
No,
symptoms you're presenting.
Fortress is not in line. Fortress allows us to think that there is a certain kind of redundancy in the very thought by which these things are being made. It is also that sometimes a command structure may know that it is redundant, and that's what this looking at the structures tell us as well. So it is reading like that. It's reading in kind of in a folded way. It is not reading like it is giving us that truth, but it is telling a kind of a spinning truth. It's like cricket you call off spin, no, it like moves like this. Now, so there, see that it is why it is connected is that you were saying toxicity. It is working. No, it is not working with toxicity. It is what it is thinks that the toxicity is something that it has commanded to a banishment, it has commanded into a invisibility. So it kind of, it starts doing a command on the material by which it is shaped. That's the kind of, you can say, the ludicrousness or the impossibility in which it is working. So that's why we move from there to the fourth through the idea of the salt. That salt mines are the best toxic dumps, but salt also holds within it other stories. And then another archaeology can tell us of other kind of labor that this salt. So there is this the salt then is doubled. We do a salt of the leg in the salt, the dinosaur leg and the Agaria legs that never burns, and the biohazard salt, so there is, and then a toxic dump will be a nightmare for an archaeologist. So there would be impossible archaeology, So there is one closure, that a nightmare, and then there is one that tells us 150 million years back. So this continuous kind of something that is moving away, trying to banish, and then something leading somewhere else. So that's the kind of, it will be interesting to, as we work further on it, how it appears. So that's why the whole thing about the dance of Shiva is, this is a popular film in 1955, no, Monica? 1955. Where it's basically, it's like the narcotic bureau would be unleashed on that song now, like it is mobile, it is telling people to smoke and dance, and then so. But the thing is that it is also recalled to a different idea of the body itself, intoxication, body being with different selves, being with different half selves, partial selves, deformed selves, and being in to be rejoice. So that's that. This is a long...
The opposite of Sparta. The desire for perfection and purity, it leads to Sparta, and then the dumping of the children at the outside of the town.
There's
If
lots of drugs in Sparta too.
Yeah, depends what state you achieve.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? You can just raise your hand.
Somebody has raised an hand.
Yeah.
Michael Song.
Michelle.
Michael?
Sorry, Michelle Song. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think Michelle went first. Michelle, please.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I'll try to be very brief and quiet because I'm in a cafe. But I was kind of wondering about your curatorial work, whether it has any parallel to how the three of you work together. And also, I'm wondering if the process is like how you present it to us today. Do you kind of do the same presentation to the artists, or how do you think about other people's work in relation to the topics that you've been thinking about currently, toxic care and luminosity? Thank you.
My partners. No, see what the presentation or the way we made this argument, we do this as a form. We play with tone, play with intonation, play with changing of the rhythms of a text to make an argument that an argument is not just an argument, it is also laying out a possibility of absorbing it, like how do you absorb the relays of the images, the text. So that's the form. So, and we don't think that this is a specific thing that we are working, specific form or specific test or experiment that we work with between us in different contexts and different invited contexts. So that's very little to do with how we talk with people. How we talk with people will be more a relay, and disagreements, relay, keeping things little open for further elaboration. Specifically, say an artist conversation in a Biennale context, one of the biggest thing is the scale of the conversation. What is the scale in which the ideas are developing? What kind of movement that these ideas, artist work and the ideas that you're working with diverge, converge, and they produce what kind of shapes. So that's much more prolonged, stuttering works with many moves, many misunderstandings, understandings, lucidities, sometimes great provocation, sometimes artist finds it very illuminating to move with the prompt, sometimes they move with their own moves. That's why we work now with the procedures of sources, with lateral, with the collegium sources. We have multiple different ways in which we work now. We don't work with specifically as we are curator or we are artists like that. In a recent show we did in Vienna, Hungry for Time, we are contemporary artists. We have artworks from the collection, which has Hieronymus Bosch and Egon Schiele and many unknown artists from the collection, 400-year-old unknown artists. And we have our work also. So, and this is a conversation. It's a conversation that takes on different kind of route. There is no specific method. It is to be invented, discovered at each point.
Virangana, would you like to ask your question now? Thanks, Monica, Jibish, for that presentation. Jibish, I wanted to pick up on what you said about catastrophe in double time in relation to how Afterglow was translated as a title in Japanese, where they spoke about seizing or catching the broken pieces of the debris of light, but also to carry that forward into how we absorb things from our memory and our senses as past residues, and carry that forward into something you'd use to describe provisions for everybody of anywhere and any when. So the way very often memory, how that plays out regardless of time or regardless of situation, into this anywhere and any when, and hence comes into this double time of catastrophe.
Thank you. Sid, this double time was more an analytical move to work with how to work with something that is very, very present. So you make certain moves over it. Double time is not necessarily just 2 orders of time. It means that they are working into 2 different temporalities, and it could be multiple temporalities also. But you have to make a work over it. So you make it do some other work than what it was supposed to do, and then you actually in it you find that there is some kind of logic that keeps it unstable. It is not fully stable. So, and when that afterglow, that's why I was earlier telling Falguni that this whole thing of the moving away from this kind of large thing called the darkness, light, enlightenment, these formations, afterglow was that period, the 3-4 years, and it actually started in 2015-16 onwards, became for us an important moment to through our own practice and practice with other contemporary, looking and working and thinking with other contemporary artists, was to find a way to actually express this sense of a spectral presence, where the debris and the luminosity do not cancel each other, do not become one teleologically, one locked away to one. So from the debris to luminosity, or from luminosity becoming debris, some kind of apocalyptic teleology or some kind of redemptive. So no, it is a spectral thing where there is a luminosity and the debris. So the Japanese translation actually helped us. So that's why we write it. That's why it was edited. Our editor brought that in from it was a email conversation with the translator, and so we bring it in a public life. One of the reasons was that actually then makes us think, and makes everyone we share with think differently about it. This does away with the opposition of the debris and luminosity. We knew that we were working with that, but we didn't have the word to express it. The Japanese word allowed that expression, that these are not oppositions. These are kind of spectral presences. These are actually something that we all move with and illuminate, and move with the force of those moments or luminosities or debris. There is, in mourning, in many forms of, you will find this intensities where they don't play out in opposition way. So, but in this whole future present, this whole logic of critique of capital, we have landed up in some kind of very clear, separations. First, the Enlightenment project did this separation of darkness, and then now we make a lot of this catastrophe and non-catastrophe. I don't know what is non-catastrophe or what is catastrophe. But it's like we don't see anything, but we keep on merging. I was once in Accra, in Ghana. There was this young artist who was narrating, and there was this one catastrophe. He was saying that she was working on slave ships, and she said that she was describing the condition of the slave ship, the lower bottom where people were, and only 10% would cross, and the rest would just perish. So she was, what is this futurity of catastrophe, when the way a population moved in the world was this kind? But her narrative was interesting, was that they have claimed a different history after they went to Americas, or she was talking about America, and that 400-year-old history, when it has to then talk about catastrophe, they can't bypass this, this category as something in the future, something in the past, but they have to think through it. So this, we have to start thinking that these are not something that are separatable categories, that's why we had to work with luminosity and toxicity together. You don't actually, and you ask and now with pandemic, with care worker, you ask any care worker, they will tell you our body is a site of toxicity. If you fall ill, you have to be taken care of. The care first is that the toxic from your body, which is coming out, has to be taken care of through sponging, through cleaning your shit, to cleaning your urine. So toxicity is now is not something that you can push away as that doesn't work for me, but you have to find a new ethic or a new thought about it. Same with, so this is something that we, over the last few years of our work, and that's where the banishment, the structures, that's like Indian civilization banishing toxicity into untouchability, and the lives of people being completely wiped away from even thought, even recognition. This kind of, you start rethinking the whole paradigm, and that's where the debris and the luminosity are together. They are not opposed to each other.
Do we have any other questions? Or I can just maybe make a quick closing remark. Yeah, I just thought, sorry, Rohit, do you have a question?
I was going to say, do we have anything on the YouTube? Or?
Oh yeah, could someone check, please? Shama, maybe?
So far, I think you can continue with.
Okay, I just thought we could close with, I'm just curious to know, because we started with the unpacking of time, and we're talking so much about luminosity now. So this sort of, I wouldn't really call it a shift, but it's kind of, it's not a logical progression either. Perhaps I don't have the word for it, and you can fill in for me. But this sort of move from the unpacking of time to a sort of a curiosity about light. Right, and why that move is so interesting to me in your practice, and I'm hoping we can close with your thoughts on this. Is because both time and light are things that you cannot hold, right? And they're, as you rightly point out, they're not things that are binary. So there's no black and white light. There's no light and darkness, as Jibesh, you were just telling us that binary. It's more a spectrum of luminosity, right? And which is also the understanding of time that you've built over your curatorial projects and your artworks over the many years, that it's really this vast unfolding spectrum. So I'm just, these similarities between time and light as concepts, I'm curious to know how this move appeared in your practice. Where do you see it going? Maybe we can close with that.
I'll just say a few very brief things. When you make this relationship between time and light, a thought that immediately occurs to me is that if light meeting any object produces immediately a shadow, then what would be the analogy for the shadow for this phenomenon of our understanding or experience of time? What's the, if you like, the shadow of time? I don't think we have an answer, but I think that some of our practice is about this meeting the shadow of time, or at least sensing it. When we were working on the Yokohama Triennial, because we were so consumed by the idea of an afterglow, we began looking at all kinds of afterglow. And one afterglow we found is something that all of us who grew up with with analog television, remember, had that momentary kind of glitch. Anyone who remembers analog TV, remember that there's that kind of little blip of light when it comes on or goes off. And we realized that that's actually because the television is set is a receiver and it's receiving frequencies. And the first frequency it receives before it receives any other signal is what is called cosmic background radiation. It's the light left over from the Big Bang. So, it's in the static of the radio, it's in the glitch in the television. And it's always interesting to think of this fact that this light that we receive or have received in our lives is actually from the moment that we conventionally now ascribe to the beginning of time itself, right? And so I don't know why I thought of that, but it's basically this idea that that light from the beginning of time is actually still right now between us, and it's one way to think about time is to meet that light, is to meet the fact that it is a signal of everything changing all the time, right? And that perhaps the resistance that material bodies give to time or give to the light that comes to us from the beginning of time is also an index of change. Perhaps that is the shadow. And so if one were to think of a relationship between light and darkness, between light and shadow, time and its shadow change, then perhaps that's where the practice is asking its questions.
Thank you. No, that's a wonderful way to put it. I'm so sorry. I said this would be sorry, I thought there was an echo. I said this would be the closing question, but we have one more on YouTube, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Shama, would you mind reading that out? I'm not sure I'm following.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I follow either, but I'll just read it out as it is. Suggesting dance Shiva in a touch catastrophic. I feel like there might be a typo there. Do you also think with manhole workers who find the way in Toxicity, perhaps most closed historical oppressed proximity by control rooms? I'm sorry, if you're still tuned in, it would be great if you could rewrite the question. But otherwise, I wonder if there are references, if Falguni are able to catch.
Sonali, he's just put it on the chat. So if anybody can decipher it, you're very welcome.
Or if you yeah, go on.
I think okay. The question, the dance of the Shiva was not actually, it was a kind of opposing the catastrophic idea. The catastrophic idea, it was the idea to move away from a catastrophic idea and to work with minimum work with the frugality of enjoyment, frugality of life. So it's a different story. And then the manhole, see, this is a very interesting idea that this whole idea of manhole worker, which is in India, it is quite a persistent reality, something that has persisted for a very long time with the modern manhole systems being made. The manhole cleaning went to primarily caste occupation was kind of diverted into, and a whole group of people mobilized manhole keeping, and somehow new techniques never seem to have reached, and the whole physical going into the manhole and cleaning. So in a sense, that oppressed proximity by control room, I don't know exactly what is the goal, but it would surely say that where forms of labor or forms of kind of working with toxicity is kind of banished from the very idea of techne itself, or the idea that people are doing it, I will banish them and they keep on doing it, becomes the logic of the apparatus itself. So the modern manhole system, which is supposed to be a modern manhole system developed over the last 100 years all over India, and something that is prized as a kind of modern sewage system, and I've read many books, somehow cannot imagine it being cleaned in any other form. And now they have some machines in some big cities. But this is the banishment that it is banished from the imaginary itself. You can have an empirical reality about it, but you cannot formulate it in your mind. The system, the apparatus, the system, and in this case, it would be it is definitely a caste-based, the upper caste inability to even imagine to how to think this through. But that's this whole thing of banishment, the cruel banishment of this. Banishment is not just the physicality of it. Physicality has broken down. Now it is porous, mobile. Life is not occupation, just occupation based. There are multiple occupations. All kinds of moves have been made. But still, not to be able to imagine the manhole cleaning in India in modern services clearly shows us something much deeper than just bad administration or inability of lack of innovation. That's what we trying to bring to our thinking, that what is this idea of the toxicity does to the very structure by which it has to be thought. So it could be in whether it is a nuclear power plant, whether it is a fortress or in a manhole. It would be important. I hope the person who is asking the question would develop this further in what does it mean? What does this modern system means in terms of its complete inability to understand the toxic? Not just the manhole also, it's also the industrial waste, it also medical hospital waste, all kinds of waste, the dump waste. You will find this complete inability. And I think that inability has reached now and in excess, that inability is in excess. So there will be hopefully a transformation and a recognition and that's Can I just
briefly respond to that? Because this thought has been strangely has been in my mind today and yesterday, because I was reading a very remarkable set of responses by a person whose work I admire a lot, Raqs Muhammad. He's the founder of the initiative known as Dalit Camera. He recently converted to Islam and took a new name. And he's continuing with his intellectual and cultural work, but also runs a septic tank cleaning business. And he's been posting a lot about the responses that people have to why, I won't refer to by his old name because he has rejected that name, why Raqs Muhammad, who is a PhD, and positions himself in somewhat as a public intellectual, as a philosopher, continues to actually professionally pursue septic tank cleaning. And he said something very interesting. He said that one reason why I pursue septic tank cleaning is to show that septic tank cleaning is possible. There are technologies available to actually deal with toxicity, and there is a kind of reluctance or a reticence on our part as a society to think through the science and technology question of toxicity and waste. And the other thing he said, which I found even more interesting, is that he said, my work as a public intellectual and as a philosopher is not to produce a professionalization of knowledge. It is to pursue knowledge and to pursue wisdom, to pursue intellectual awakening for its own sake. And he said that I make my money as a septic tank cleaning technician, engineer, but I pursue my debate, my discursive field as a philosopher. And he said that I think that people who want people from, let's say, those communities who have traditionally cleaned manholes, and he is one of those, says they wish to say that the task of being a philosopher is somehow something quite different. So there is a paradoxical way in which there is an expectation that once he's a philosopher, he should stop cleaning septic tanks. Whereas the question he's asking is, why can't philosophers also clean septic tanks? And I think that's a really interesting way to think about this relationship between contamination, toxicity, and the pursuit of thought amidst the toxic and its presence in our lives.
Thank you, Shuddha. If there are any more questions, or perhaps we can just close.
I see the name of the person who just wrote in with the question. Mohit, if you're still around and if you'd like to respond to any of their responses, feel free to do that. But otherwise, I suppose we can close.
Yes, I suppose on that note of the pursuit of thought amidst toxicity, we can.
Again, thank you so much, Jibesh, Monica, and Shuddha for an incredible presentation. Falguni, of course, thanks for so wonderfully guiding the conversation this evening. And to all those who joined us via YouTube, as well as our colloquium participants, of course, it was a pleasure to have you all this evening, and thank you so much for making it. The talk will remain live on the Warehouse 421 YouTube channel, along with our prior public talks. And you can visit either the Warehouse 421 or BCAR website in case you'd like to have a look at the complete public talk schedule for Future Perfect. Next week, we'll be joined by artist Pallavi Paul, and the following week by artist Rohini Devashar, who will also be teaching a course with us starting tomorrow, titled Borrowed Light, Speculations on Astronomy. But yes, just feel free to continue writing into us. We love to hear from you. If you have any queries about the program. And yeah, we'd love to stay in touch. Again, thank you so much for making it tonight.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Good night.